Hi AP Bio classes, today we'll be talking about wetlands. Just some background about wetlands. Wetlands link together water and land, and there are many different types of wetlands. They're known as marshes, swamps, and bogs. In order to be considered a wetland, it has to be soaked with water part of the year. Wetlands also provide a habitat for many animals and abiotic factors such as rocks, soil, water, and logs. Wetlands help to filter, clean, and store water, and they also act as a place to catch water during major flooding. This can also help with erosion, and it catches the water that falls. There are two different types of wetlands. There are non-tidal wetlands, which are at the ends of streams and rivers, and these are mostly still water and a lot of times dirtier than the wetlands at the end of mouths of the ocean, which link together freshwater and saltwater, and this is known as an estuary. Here's an example of a wetland food web, and starting at the bottom are the producers that are cattails, southern water nymph, blue or green algae, and paper birch. And these are eaten by the primary consumers, which include the North American beaver, some turtles, ducks, muskrats, and fish. And there are many insects in a wetland, and these are eaten by otters and also more turtles and frogs. And at the top of the food chain are osprey, such as hawks, raccoon, and herons.
So the first density-dependent mechanism is competition, and competition usually occurs between two or more species, and this is when a population increases, more organisms from both species must compete for nutrients and other resources such as living space and food. And an example from our wetland is the sea otter and the raccoon. So the sea otter and the raccoon both compete for living space and food as well. And this type of relationship can be expressed by two negative signs because both competitors, the sea otter and the raccoon, are being negatively affected. The second type of density-dependent regulation is predation. And predation is the interaction between two organisms where one is the predator and the other is the prey. And the predator in our wetlands, for example, is the osprey and the prey is the fish. And in this relationship, the osprey benefits while the fish is negatively affected. Predation is very common in multiple biomes and is one of the main density-dependent mechanisms within wetlands. So our first symbiotic relationship is parasitism. And symbiosis is the interaction of two or more species that live in direct and intimate contact with one another. And parasitism is a relationship between two organisms where one is benefited and the other one is negatively affected. So in the case of the wetlands, the North American beaver is the host and the parasite is the mosquito. And the mosquito is technically called an ectoparasite because it feeds on the external surface of the host. And the mosquito is benefiting from feeding off of the North American beaver. Therefore, the mosquito can be represented with a plus sign to show that it's being affected positively, and the North American beaver can be represented with a negative sign or a minus sign to show that it's being harmed. Our second symbiotic relationship is mutualism, and mutualism is an interaction between organisms in which both of them benefit, and mutualism is common in all biomes. And so in the wetland, our examples include the dragonfly and the cattail. And the dragonfly benefits from the cattail because it is provided with protection and nutrients. And the cattail is benefited from the dragonfly because the dragonfly pollinates for the cattail. Because both organisms benefit in this relationship, the cattail and the dragonfly can be represented with a plus sign. Our third and last symbiotic relationship is commensalism. And commensalism is the interaction between organisms in which one benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. So in the wetlands, our example is between the great blue heron and the cattail. And the great blue heron benefits from the cattail by nesting and being provided protection from the cattail. Because the cattail is neither helped nor harmed, it can be represented with a 0. And because the great blue heron is benefited, it can be represented with a positive plus sign.
So our first pattern of dispersion is the clumped pattern of dispersion, and it's when organisms clump together in a specific area, typically due to a certain factor. These factors might be a surplus of food, an ideal temperature, a defensive advantage, and there are other ones. For our biome of the wetland, algae is a perfect example of a clumped pattern of dispersion because the algae blooms grow together on the surface of the water and stay in these clumps, and there are different clumps spread out along the surface of the water in the wetland, and it's the perfect setting for them. So our next pattern of dispersion is uniform pattern of dispersion, and this pattern is direct interactions between individuals of the same species, usually in the form of territoriality. Territoriality is when an individual acts aggressive towards another because they're invading its space, and each individual in our wetland biome has its own space and will keep to it, so they are evenly distributed throughout the wetland. And muskrats are an example of uniform dispersion because they're highly territorial and aggressive animals, especially the females with their young, and they're all equally spaced out within the biome because of where they live. Our last pattern of dispersion is random pattern of dispersion, and this is where individuals are spread out randomly without an organized pattern within the biome. And for the wetland biome, cattails are an example of this because their seeds are spread by the wind, and this wind carries them across the water so they're able to germinate.
So next we have the survivorship curve, and survivorship curves are a graphic method of representing some of the data in a life table. So from our biome, the striped marsh frog is an example of a type 3 survivorship curve. Characteristics of type 3 curves include very high death rates for the young and gradual flattening out of death rates as the percentage of maximum lifespan increases. Type 3 curves also produce large numbers of offspring, but provide very little to no amounts of parental care. The striped marsh frog fits into this curve because of its high death rates, large amounts of offspring, and minimal parental care. The number of survivors decreases as the percentage of maximum life expectancy increases.
The carbon cycle is the process in which carbon travels from the atmosphere into organisms in the earth and then back into the atmosphere. In the carbon cycle in wetlands, plants take in carbon in order to create food from the sun. And then when the plants are eaten, the CO2 is then transferred to animals who eat them. When the animals die, the CO2 is released into the air and may go into the ground from decomposers. The CO2 is also released when animals breathe. An example from the food web from a wetland is the cattails. The cattails use CO2 from the air and sunlight to make glucose and photosynthesis. Then when the mallard, common loon, muskrat, and turtle eat the cattail, the CO2 is passed on to them, and then passed to the osprey, who is at the top of the food web. When the osprey dies, the CO2 is released into the air and decomposers put it back into the soil. Wetlands hold 35% of the world's carbon and holds most of their carbon in carbon-rich sediments.
The parts of the water cycle include evaporation from oceans, rivers, and lakes, then condensation, precipitation, and surface runoff. The water cycle is imperative to an organism's survival in a wetland. Since a wetland is land that is flooded by water, covering the soil of that region, a unique combination of aquatic plants and animals have adapted to the area. Evaporation in a wetland would decrease the amount of water covering the soil, which means that aquatic animals would have less living room, like the bullfrog that lives in and out of the water, and plants would experience changes in nutrient levels from the soil, specifically cattails and the paper birch trees, because they live partly in the water of the wetland. However, when there is surface runoff, many of the same nutrients will return to the soil in the wetland.
Next is the nitrogen cycle, and nitrogen is a very important element in our atmosphere because it makes up 78% of it. So the first step of the nitrogen cycle is fixation, and fixation is when nitrogen is made usable by plants, including the cattail in the wetlands, and here bacteria change nitrogen into ammonium. The next step is nitrification, and in this process, ammonium gets changed into nitrates by bacteria such as blue-green algae in the wetlands, and nitrates are what the plants can then absorb. The next step is assimilation, and in this step, plants are able to receive the nitrogen. Plants such as the cattail absorb nitrates from the soil into their roots, and then the nitrogen gets used in amino acids and their chlorophyll. The next step is ammonification, and this is when the decaying of plants and animals such as the dragonfly and the snapping turtle and the cattail begin. When the plant and animal dies, the decomposers such as fungi and bacteria in the water of the wetlands turns the nitrogen back into ammonium so that it can then re-enter the nitrogen cycle. The last step is denitrification, and this is when extra nitrogen from the soil and the organisms in the soil gets put back into the air.
So our next cycle is the phosphorus cycle, and the way this works is that over time, rain and various types of harsh weather cause the rocks in the area to release phosphate as well as other various minerals, and they are then distributed in the soil and the water of the wetland. Plants, like southern water nymphs, absorb the inorganic phosphate from the soil. The plant can be consumed by the painted turtle, and the phosphate would be transferred into the animal. When the turtle dies and then decays, the organic form of phosphate is then returned to the soil. Bacteria in the soil then break down organic phosphate to inorganic forms of phosphorus, which is the process of mineralization, and plants can once again take up the phosphorus. Since phosphorus in the soil is underwater, it can be made into sediments with time. The phosphorus cycle is constant within the wetland biome and is very important to this area.
An example of a human disturbance in a wetland is land development. When land is cleared above a wetland, the land erodes into the wetland. This increases the sedimentation in the low wetlands, and the sedimentation can alter the chemical and hydraulic makeup in the wetland. Building dams and creating water channels changes the natural course of water and can affect the movement of water into the wetland. Another human disturbance in wetlands is pollution that drains into marshlands. This can change the water and affects the nutrients that organisms need in marshlands. This can be in the form of urban runoff or agricultural runoff. And a lot of times in fertilized crops, the pesticides run into the wetlands and affect the animals. This can affect the reproduction of a species, and this poses a serious threat to the biological diversity in a wetland.